Imagine sending your child to school on a Wednesday morning. They wave goodbye at the door. Lunch pail in hand. Coat buttoned up. And by the time the clock strikes 10, they are gone. Not missing. Not injured. Gone. This is not a story about war. It is not a story about famine or plague. This is a story about a school. A perfectly ordinary school. In a perfectly ordinary American town. And what happened there on the morning of March 4, 1908, was not an accident. It was inevitable. In the early 1900s, on the northeastern edge of Cleveland, Ohio, sat a small but growing village called Collinwood, and from the outside it looked like progress itself, because the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railway had chosen this stretch of land as a major switching hub, and almost overnight a quiet lakeside settlement transformed into a buzzing industrial suburb with over 120 miles of rail track cutting through the landscape, repair sheds and freight depots spreading in every direction, and the smoke from the locomotives never stopped. But to the people of Collinwood, that smoke meant wages, that smoke meant work, that smoke meant a future, and so they came from Ireland, from Germany, from Scandinavia, and in growing numbers from southern and eastern Europe, Slovenians, Poles, Hungarians, Italians, families who had crossed an entire ocean following the rumor of steady employment, until within just a few years the population exploded beyond anything the village had prepared for. The water supply was outdated, the sewer system was unreliable, and the fire protection was a volunteer department with horse-drawn equipment operated by men who held other jobs and were called to duty only when something went wrong, exactly the kind of arrangement that works perfectly until the one day it does not. In the heart of this working-class community stood Lakeview School on Collimer Street, and for the immigrant families of Collinwood this building was more than a place of education. It was a symbol of faith, the belief that everything they had endured, the long voyage, the cramped rooms, the exhausting shifts at the rail yard, would eventually lead somewhere better for their children, that their sons and daughters would belong to this country in a way the parents themselves were still struggling to, and every morning 360 children walked through those doors. From the outside, Lakeview looked strong, solid red brick, permanent, safe, but beneath the brick exterior almost everything was wood, yellow pine framing, oiled wooden floors, wooden staircases, wooden ceiling joists, and running directly beneath all of this the building's steam heating pipes pressed up close against the wooden framework above them, which was an arrangement nobody had given any particular thought to, and when the school expanded in 1906 and doubled its student capacity, not a single new exit was created, no fireproofing was added, and a design that had barely worked for a smaller school was simply stretched without anyone asking what that meant for 360 children trying to leave a burning building at the same time. The architects of that era had already been writing about exactly these dangers, recommending steel framing and enclosed fireproof stairwells, but Lakeview had none of it. Its main staircase ran open and uninterrupted from the basement to the attic, which in engineering terms was not a stairwell but a chimney. And the rear exit had been converted over time into a cloakroom vestibule with coat hooks on both sides and partitions built against the doorframe until the usable width of that exit. The second and final way out for every child in the building was just over 2 feet wide, and the building had been inspected and signed off at every stage because the danger was not hidden, it simply had never been looked for. On the morning of March 4, 1908, Ash Wednesday, Fritz Herder arrived before 6 o'clock to stoke the furnace and warm the building as he did every morning. A father of 8 and a man who knew every corner of Lakeview the way only a custodian can, and by 9 o'clock every classroom was full and every teacher was at her desk and the rhythm of an ordinary school day had settled over the building, until Fritz Herder, sweeping in the basement, saw it, a thin curl of smoke rising from beneath the front staircase, almost gentle at first, the kind of thing you might mistake for dust catching the morning light, but Herder knew what the basement smelled like on an ordinary morning and this was not that, so he dropped everything, sprinted across the basement, pulled the fire alarm gong, and ran upstairs to start opening classroom doors and calling out to the children. In the classrooms the alarm was treated almost like a routine drill and teachers lined their students up and began moving them toward the exits in an orderly fashion, but none of them knew that the fire had been building beneath their feet for weeks, that the flames had already found the open stairwell, and that physics was now doing exactly what the building's geometry had always demanded of it. The fire roared upward from basement to attic like a draft through a chimney, the yellow pine and the oiled floors and the unbroken column of air all burning exactly the way they were always going to burn, and the children at the front of the line saw the flames, and everything that had been orderly became in the space of a few seconds something else entirely. Children heading toward the front doors turned and ran back, but behind them more children were still coming down the stairs and there was nowhere to reverse. The hallways became a river of panic with children pressing forward into children trying to go back, screaming blending with the roar of fire overhead, until the rear exit became the only option and hundreds of children flooded toward it at once, and the children who arrived first pressed against the door opened outward. It always had, but the wave of children arriving from behind was coming faster than the door could clear, and the pressure built until children began to fall and the children behind them could not see them fall, and the pile grew to 5 feet, to 6 feet, packed so densely that the exit became completely impassable in either direction. Rescuers outside, parents, police, railway workers who had sprinted from nearby yards hammered and kicked and tore at those same doors with bleeding hands, but the doors were not locked and had never been locked, and it made no difference, because on the other side was a mass of children so tightly compressed that no force from outside could move it. Teacher Catherine Weiler had turned her class away from the fire, guided them through the packed hallways, and taken a position at the edge of the crush, pulling children free with her hands. She had time to find another way out and chose not to take it, and when the mass shifted she went down with it, while first-grade teacher Ruby Irwin broke a window with a bench and lowered half her class one by one into the arms of adults waiting below, saving every child she could physically reach before the heat drove her back. 9-year-old Niles Thompson made it out through a window, landed in the crowd outside, moved through every face searching for his younger brother Thomas, and when Thomas was not among them he turned and went back into the building, and neither brother came out again. The volunteer fire department arrived to find a building past saving, and when additional engines came from Cleveland they found 4 blackened walls with nothing moving inside. The fire had taken less than 1 hour. 172 children were dead along with 2 teachers and 1 rescuer, and 19 of the bodies recovered were burned so completely that no identification was possible. In the days that followed, Collinwood buried its children, and in a village of 8,000 people nearly every family had either lost a child or knew a family that had, and funeral processions moved through the streets in a continuous stream, one overlapping with the next, until 3 days after the fire a public burial was held for the 19 unidentified children. 19 white caskets lowered into a common grave at Lakeview Cemetery, each one carrying a number corresponding to a scrap of clothing or a piece of jewelry or a physical description, in the hope that some family might eventually match the number to a name, and some families never did. The search for blame began almost immediately, and within hours it landed on Fritz Herder. He was foreign, he was male, he had been alone in the basement, and in the logic of public outrage that was enough. But the inquest told a different story, tracing the fire to a steam pipe pressed against a wooden floor joist that had been slowly heating over weeks until it reached the ignition point of dry oiled wood, and the coroner's findings attributed the deaths to structural conditions, to a building that should never have been built the way it was, because Fritz Herder had pulled the alarm the moment he saw smoke, had thrown children through windows to rescuers outside, and had been driven out only when the flames overwhelmed him with his face and hands burned, and inside the wreckage of that building 3 of his own children lay dead. The inquest cleared him, and the rumors largely ignored it, because that is what rumors do. Bereaved parents, many of them not yet fluent in English and uncertain of their rights in a country they were still learning to inhabit, gathered in groups and demanded answers across 4 different languages, and at one meeting a father stood and said simply, "The school board is not to blame, they tell us. So then, who is?" And there was no satisfying answer, because the honest answer pointed not to a person but to a system, a series of decisions made over years by people who had never imagined their consequences, and systems are the hardest thing of all to hold accountable. Collinwood did produce real changes. Crash bars, the push to open emergency exit hardware on virtually every public door today, were first mass manufactured in the years following this fire because of what happened in that vestibule. Outward opening exits became codified into building standards, fire drills became mandatory practice, doorways were widened, and these changes saved lives and deserved to be acknowledged, but they were not enough, because surveys in the years after showed fewer than 1 in 10 new school buildings were being built to fireproof specifications, and 3 years after Collinwood fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York and 146 workers died in circumstances that carried real parallels, but Triangle produced 56 new state laws in 4 years and named owners who stood trial in a story that became a permanent part of the American historical record, while Collinwood produced modest reforms, a brief national moment, and then silence. Because Triangle had identifiable villains who could be placed in a courtroom while Collinwood had only conditions, and conditions do not make a clear enemy, and it would take 50 more years and another school fire in Chicago before the federal government finally mandated comprehensive fire safety standards for schools, 50 years after everything Collinwood had already shown. There is a park today where Lakeview School once stood, a quiet street in what is now a neighborhood of Cleveland, a garden, a path, the particular stillness that belongs to places deliberately set apart from ordinary use, And at the cemetery nearby, a monument marks the common grave of the 19 unidentified children, with a bronze tablet carrying names long and varied drawn from every nationality that made up Collinwood in 1908. The last known survivor was Ella Smith, the daughter of Fritz Herter, who had been a young student inside the building that morning and who carried through her long life the weight of wanting people to hold two things at once: that her father had been blameless, and that he had been devastated, that culpability and loss do not always land in the same place, and she died in 2001 at the age of 99. Collinwood has been largely forgotten by the national memory. Ask 100 people about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and a meaningful number will know it. Ask about Collinwood and almost none will, but it has not disappeared, because it lives in the metal bar across every emergency exit door you have ever pushed, the bar that opens under pressure, that requires no handle, no key, no turning motion, that yields simply to the weight of a human body moving toward it in fear, and that bar exists. Because of what happened on a Wednesday morning in 1908 in a small Ohio village most of the country has never heard of. The fire drill, the outward opening exit, the enclosed fireproof stairwell, the minimum exit width, all of it is the accumulated answer to a question Collinwood posed with devastating and irreversible clarity, and 172 children who walked into school that morning and never came home paid for those lessons with their lives. The least we can do is remember where they came from.